Having already considered crowding out, a drop in the bucket, and a matter of timing as limits to fiscal policy, there's still one other important limit to consider. Fiscal policy does not work well to combat real shocks. Remember, real shocks reduce the productivity of labor and capital and will shift the solo growth curve to the left. Since the economy is at full employment, fiscal policy will crowd out private spending, and most of the effect is going to show up as an increase in inflation. So let's take a look at why this is so. Here we have an economy that is currently at full employment, has a growth rate of 3%, spending growth of 5%, and of course from that we can derive the inflation rate of 2%. Now suppose this economy is hit with a negative real shock. In this case, the negative real shock will move us from an equilibrium at point A to this new equilibrium at point B, where the economy has fallen into recession. We see it has a negative growth rate of 3% and is experiencing 8% inflation. Assuming nothing is done, we know that inflation expectations will adjust, and the short run aggregate supply curve will shift up to reflect those new inflation expectations. Now, if the economy tries to implement fiscal policy to restore economic growth, the fiscal policy is going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. We reach a new equilibrium at point C. We see that most of the fiscal spending is going to result in higher inflation and very little economic growth. So despite the fact that the economy is still in recession, its decline is not as high as it was previously, but most of the spending is being allocated towards higher inflation versus the spending on new goods and services. In the previous slides, we talked about limits to fiscal policy, but there may actually be cases where fiscal policy can actually make matters worse. In extreme situations, additional government borrowing can lead to an economic collapse. Examples of this include what happened in Argentina, Greece, Thailand, Mexico, and Indonesia. In each of these countries, the government debt rose as a share of GDP. If the debt to GDP ratio is really large, then countries are in danger of defaulting on their debt. It's going to be hard for them to pay off debt with the amount of income that they are earning. This threat of default is going to drive investment away from these countries and causes all sorts of larger ramifications. As the investment is driven away, you're going to have a decrease in the capital stock. You're going to find that the economy may move into recession, leads to higher unemployment, and so this leads to a general economic crisis. Another reason why fiscal policy might make matters worse is if the expansionary fiscal policy is always paid for by borrowing, then taxes are going to rise in the future. And that means future generations are going to have to pay those taxes, and the higher future taxes will contract the economy because the income that the country earns is being used to pay off the debt and not used to buy new goods and services. So ideally, fiscal policy should increase aggregate demand in bad times, and during good times we should pay off these debts. However, the government usually operates like this. They increase their spending in bad times, they increase their spending in good times, and the result is continuously rising debt. Now, fiscal policy is not all bad. We've just listed limitations, we've listed some cases where it can make things worse, but fiscal policy is best when the economy needs a short-run boost, even though this could lead to consequences in the long run. The idea is get us back to full employment. When the economy reaches full employment, pay off that debt. Fiscal policy works when the problem is a deficiency in aggregate demand rather than a real shock. So if you have a situation where consumers and firms just aren't spending, then the government can spend to get the economy back to full employment. And fiscal policy works when many resources are unemployed. So this concludes our discussion on fiscal policy. Have a good one.